And I fail to believe that the world can profit from a man's death. And I think each and every one of you should be really ashamed of yourself.
And who are you?
I'm the dude that killed him.
On September 8th of 2022, Her Royal Majesty Queen Elizabeth II passed away at the age of 96, and while thousands mourned the loss of the longest-reigning British monarch, with teary eyes and seas of floral arrangements placed at Buckingham Palace and Balmoral and Windsor castles, others were popping bottles of bubbly in celebration of the death of a woman they saw as an imperialist colonizer and tyrant. For example, Uju Anya, a modern language professor at Carnegie Mellon University and proponent of critical race theory, went on a tirade on Twitter posting that, quote, "Heard the chief monarch of a thieving genocidal empire is finally dying. May her pain be excruciating. If anyone expects me to express anything but disdain for the monarch who supervised a government that sponsored the genocide that massacred and displaced half of my family, and the consequences of which those alive today are still trying to overcome, you can keep wishing upon a star. That wretched woman and her bloodthirsty throne have generations of my ancestors on both sides of the family, and she supervised a government that sponsored the genocide my parents and siblings survived. May she die in agony." Which of course sparked outrage so severe that Twitter itself removed the messages for violating their terms of service, and was seen as so egregious that even Jeff Bezos himself expressed disgust with the posts. Despite a petition to remove her from her position on the faculty from Foundational Black Americans receiving over 1,700 signatures, not for her comments on the Queen, but rather for her use of the term Akata, a West African term for African Americans considered by many to be a slur, the university condemned her words but refused to take any action against Anya, illustrating a form of unspoken support, comparative to Twitter even. An Argentine presenter, Santiago Cueno, literally popped a bottle of champagne on his program, asking for, quote, "loud applause for Satan taking her away," in a clip that has been since removed from his website after drawing ire from fellow commenters and journalists. Santiago was not the only one to crack a bottle in celebration of the 96-year-old woman's passing, as a video of a Scottish chip shop owner, Jackie Pickett, went viral wherein she also popped some bubbly while holding a sign that reads "Lizard Liz is dead," prompting a crowd of locals to gather around her shop and pelt it with eggs and rocks, becoming increasingly agitated to the point where the police were called to remove her from the location for her own safety.
Ta-ta, darling, ta-ta!
In response, the National Federation of Fish Fryers removed her membership. Even Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was filmed jovially singing Bohemian Rhapsody in a hotel lobby just 2 days before the Queen's funeral. Perhaps someone should remind Justin that he signed an oath of loyalty to the Crown.
I, Justin P.J. Trudeau, do solemnly and sincerely swear that I shall be a true and faithful servant to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II as a member of Her Majesty's Privy Council for Canada.
And that ultimately, he served at His Majesty King Charles's pleasure. Clearly, while there were plenty of people who were happy that the Queen, a woman that they likely were unaware had done more to reduce the size and scope of the British Empire that they so despise than any other monarch, outward displays of jubilation at her death were simply seen as socially unacceptable. And I mean, I'm no saint here, as I once made a distasteful tweet saying "Ding dong, the witch is dead" in the wake of the passing of John McCain, something that I regret and have apologized for because it wasn't just tasteless, it was also disrespectful to his loved ones, even if he was a warmonger. So the question is then, when and where is it acceptable to speak ill of the dead? And how has social media influenced how we mourn the death of a public figure? And how do we police the norms of grief expressed both online and off? Let's begin by examining parasocial relationships and fan reactions to the loss of a parasocial loved one. But first, it's not just the Queen's death that sparked controversy. A lot of outrage also surrounds the Crown's wealth, long funded by the British taxpayer, particularly after the news broke that the royal family wouldn't pay any inheritance tax after the Queen's death. It's led to many calls for transparency from some around the royal family's wealth, but the results of any investigation are sure to be disappointing. And that's because a huge part of the royal family's wealth is in assets that, up until last year, had never been fully known to the public, or even the royal family itself, which is interesting because this could be their most valuable asset of them all. I'm talking about the Royal Collection, a massive catalog of approximately 7,000 paintings, 30,000 watercolors, and 500,000 prints, combined with the crown jewels. This collection is worth an estimated £10 billion. The collection isn't just about history, it also preserves the crown's wealth, even as $13 trillion has been wiped from the stock market this last year. And inflation could skyrocket to over 20% in the UK. The Crown has continued to build out its art collection with contemporary artists like Warhol because data show that contemporary art has outpaced even the S&P 500 by more than double, and that's for the last 26 years straight. And the last time inflation was this high, it performed even better, beating traditional hedges like gold and real estate, with an average appreciation of 33% per year. But you're not the Queen of England. How do you help preserve your wealth with multi-million-dollar art? You go to Masterworks. If you haven't heard of Masterworks, allow me to quickly explain the idea. Masterworks buys high-end contemporary art, securitizes it with the SEC, and offers it to their members in the form of shares. This means that you can see the incredible potential results of investing in this high-end contemporary art at a price that works for you. They've sold 6 paintings so far with an average return of 29% to their investors, so you can see why there's a wait list as traditional investments continue to suffer. But my viewers can skip this wait, joining their over 500,000 members simply by going to masterworks.art/Aiden, linked below in the description and in the pinned comment. Thanks so much to Masterworks for sponsoring this video, and now that we have a way to own a priceless piece of history and art, let's talk about the people who make history and art, and how their deaths affect us all. Just as we have relationships with real people, friends, and family, for whom we mourn when one of them passes away, we can also form something akin to a relationship, specifically a parasocial relationship with media figures with whom we will likely never meet. Horton and Wohl, 1956, originally coined the term parasocial interaction to describe an individual instance wherein a viewer of mass media feels as if an interaction between themselves and characters on the screen is real. For example, shouting, "Look out," to a character in a horror movie, as if we have some capacity to aid the fictional co-ed about to be attacked by a villain. That's a parasocial interaction. A parasocial relationship is the product of a period of exposure to a media figure, real or fictional, with whom we have had multiple parasocial interactions, and thus have come to see and feel as if we know personally. Just as with real-life relationships, Cohen 2003 found that if a viewer had come to develop feelings of friendship towards a character in a television program, and the character left, died, or the show ended, that viewer experienced significant negative emotions. Eyal and Cohen 2006 found that people felt greater loss if a character passed away, particularly when they were more committed to the show itself. Just as people can mourn for fictional characters that we feel connected to, we can also mourn for very real people that we similarly share a mere parasocial relationship with, something that was on full display in the outpourings of both love and grief that accompanied the death and funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. But were these types of reactions that we saw in response to the Queen's death unusual, or actually quite typical of the responses, particularly online, to the death of a public figure? Let's change focus then from the Queen of England to the King of Pop, and see how his death affected fans and non-fans alike. Sanderson and Hope Cheong, 2010, examined the way that people communicated on Twitter, Facebook, and in the comments of a TMZ article that broke the story of the King's passing in the 4 weeks following the death of Michael Jackson, who, while beloved, has also been the object of some extensive criticisms and claims of misconduct, relating posts to the stages of grief and religious discourse, and identifying thematic elements in the global discussion. The researchers found evidence for all of the stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Several made mention of Jackson now being in a better place. Others made declarations of love and admiration for the King of Pop, while many also reminisced on their own lives and their memories of Jackson's music. Inevitably, though, politics entered the chat. With some defending his innocence against predatory accusations, given that unlike the Queen, who was 96 and whose death was an inevitability that everyone was aware would come at basically any time, Jackson's death, aged only 50, shocked the world. And as such, it's perhaps unsurprising that plenty of Twitter users were in denial of his passing, either doubting the information itself or holding out hope that the singer was still alive. Anger and bargaining were rare within Twitter comments, but were still present, with anger largely being directed at Jackson's accusers and his doctor, who did go on to serve a brief stint in prison after being convicted of involuntary manslaughter for administering the drugs that caused his death. While bargaining took the form of users praying that he was not dead, and instead just in critical condition and wishing for his speedy recovery, while others simply prayed for his soul to pass through the pearly gates. Although not one of the stages of grief, the researchers also identified a fifth theme in the discourse, that being criticism. While this behavior was not found in their analysis of Twitter, it was present in the comments of the TMZ article and on Facebook. For example, quote, "Rip MJ, born a cute little black boy, died an ugly white woman. I'm glad he's dead, nuff said. Has the almost entire freaking world forgotten that this freak of a human being was an admitted I'm not bothered he died, he was a and, quote, he children, he wasn't a great person." It may be because of the nature of Twitter, particularly at the time before the post limit was increased to extend beyond 180 characters, that led to the responses to Jackson's death being a little bit more uncritical of his person. While posters on TMZ and Facebook were able to write lengthier responses and castigations of the pop star. But whatever the reason, people were far more likely to talk trash outside of the Bird app, at least in this one particular instance, as unusual as I'm sure that sounds. The Twitter dataset in this study did, however, only include interactions on the Michael Jackson News Twitter feed, which included just under 800 tweets, comparative to the Facebook and TMZ datasets, which comprised 4.5 and 7.3 thousand posts discussing the recently passed away pop star, respectively, and the 7.3 thousand posters on TMZ being also a representative sample of people who struggled to walk and breathe at the same time, whose eyelids blink at different speeds, and who drink Sherwin-Williams like it's an Arnold Palmer. As such, it may just be the nature of the dataset, rather than the site itself, that made Twitter, for once, the least toxic place for people to talk about a deceased celebrity. Perhaps the most damning indictment of my field yet. It's like having a clinical drug trial where the control group is all on Pervitin.
Fucking ID.
Religious-type discourse also framed much of the conversation regarding Jackson's death, which these scholars broke down into 5 categories: coping, seething, and molding. Wait.
Yes, you're coping and seething.
Just kidding.
But it's best to probably get the coping memes out of the way up front, because that word is going to come up several times. Anyway, in all seriousness, the categories were coping, empathy, condemnation, proselytizing, and worship. Worship included posts that invoked religious language in relationship to Jackson, such as calling him king or prince. Coping language involved sentiments that he was in a better place. Empathy posts wished well on Jackson's family and asked for blessings from the divine. Condemnation messages expressed scorn for the pop star, for example, hoping that he was suffering in hell. And finally, proselytizing posts used their platform to share Michael's music and spread his work around. On Twitter, expressions of grief were rare comparative to proselytizing, with fans creating Michael Mondays events to celebrate his music. The Facebook and TMZ comment sections were more likely to see condemnatory posts, however, but the fan groups on Facebook were also prone to react negatively to such messages. Another study that specifically assessed Twitter communication regarding the death of Jackson from Lee and Go 2013 further revealed that while outpouring of love and remembrance were the most common type of message, anger and hatred were also quite prominent. These scholars collected 50,000 tweets during the 12 days directly after Jackson's death, using hashtags and words related to the King of Pop to identify relevant messages related to emotional support, informational support, and non-support related categories. The most commonly posted tweets, 28.3%, were concerned only with sharing news, while the second most common message type was rumor spreading, comprising 13.3% of tweets, or as TMZ would refer to these two categories, the same thing. After rumors, tributes were the next most frequently shared posts, at 12.7%, and then spam at 10.19%, and expressions of grief at 10.17%. Overt hatred towards Jackson was rare, comprising only 2.5% of all messages related to his passing. But jokes about his death were slightly more common, making up 3.8% of posts, which seems somewhat shockingly low given the fact that pretty much everyone had a joke to make at Michael's expense.
You know how in the future everyone will say, "Oh, do you remember where you were when Michael Jackson died?" Almost everybody will be able to answer, "I was texting a joke about Michael Jackson."
Looking specifically at the messages not related to informational or social support in regards to Jackson's death, rumors were the most common, with many questioning the circumstances surrounding his death and believing the entire story was a scam even, be it some kind of insurance fraud or method of gaining new attention, speculating about a possible conspiracy, gossip about other celebrities, and insinuations that the star was still alive. Of the just over 10% of comments that were considered spam, these fell into 4 general categories. Attention-seeking, which were seemingly random posts using the associated hashtags to draw eyes towards their Twitter account. For example, quote, "I like cheese, hashtag Michael Jackson."
Lol. As you can see, I'm very random.
Spamming was similar in this category, with some users simply utilizing the death to promote their product or service, and other tweets took the opportunity to bring in unrelated topics and opinions and issues, again likely just capitalizing on the trend to spew their opinion on their personal pet project from a larger-than-average soapbox. Finally, of this 10% of posts that could be considered spam, the last type was just pure gibberish, again likely seeking any attention and any reaction from the wider Twitter user base, including tagging Dr. Phil in one example. Never a wise choice.
Open the door or I'm gonna throw rocks through your windows, you dumb whore.
Humorous tweets were about the kind of insensitive or irreverent messages that you might expect, including claims that the singer had been cryogenically frozen, political jokes, and jabs at the allegations of Jackson being a predator, references to the music industry at large, and mockery of Jackson's infamously bizarre lifestyle. So bizarre he may be the only man that the Jehovah's Witnesses asked politely to leave them.
Your government is watching you and your government wants you to be happy. Have a nice day!
Finally, the 2.5% of tweets that were explicitly angry and hateful towards Jackson typically concerned the aforementioned predatory allegations, castigation of Jackson's supporters and fans, and in opposition, anger towards Jackson's haters, irritation with the media attention that his death was receiving, disgust towards those around Jackson, who many users believed had betrayed or taken advantage of him, and complaints that Jackson's death was trending, being indicative of just a slow news day. As the evidence we've seen so far has been indicative, even though there certainly were plenty of people mocking and even celebrating the death of Michael Jackson, the most common sentiments were either neutral, merely sharing information about it, or supportive. Thus, to better understand how people react to the death of a famous person, at least on the internet, we should look to the role of parasocial relationships in users' reactions online, which we can do by looking to a study from Courbet and Fourquet Courbet, 2014, who surveyed 29 French participants who identified themselves as being longtime MJ fans. Although the sample size here is very small, the participants were themselves rather diverse, with 5 being in liberal professions and management, 7 being white-collar workers, 13 being students, 1 musician, 2 salespeople, and 1 unemployed fan. The subjects were interviewed between 15 and 21 weeks after Jackson's death, questioning them on their parasocial relationship with the pop star and their reactions to his passing. Many of the participants learned about the King of Pop's death via text message from their friends or family, after which it was common for them to confirm the report by turning to TV news.
Even the doctor that was announcing that he died had a look across his face like, I've got one. He touched millions of fans. People are going to love this.
There was some immediate cognitive dissonance from some in reaction to the death, with 23-year-old Emma reporting being shocked at the news and being at a loss of what to even do. Several noted that Michael's death was a kind of personal death for their own history, an element of their life that was now gone and relegated to memories. Some of this loss was perhaps particularly personal, hitting them right in the wallet if they happened to be ticket holders for his unfortunately titled This Is It tour.
I've never said this is it in a celebratory fashion. Let me just say, white people do it all the time. This is it. Not every time we say it like this. You know what? This is it.
Recalling personal memories and emotions that Michael's music evoked were common amongst these fans, with some even expressing fear that losing the pop star left they themselves somewhat more alone in the world. Mortality salience is a psychological phenomenon that describes a tendency we all have to relate death in general to the knowledge and thoughts of our own mortality, something that is discomforting and often terrifying to even consider. As such, for these fans, the death of MJ forced them to consider their own inevitable death or the deaths of their loved ones, as Flora related her mother's passing 2 years prior and how her mother had inspired her personal love for Jackson's music. While his death caused reflection in some, it produced severe sadness in others, with Paul stating, quote, "I suffered a lot. Part of myself died that day." Outpourings of love on social media were frequent, with fans posting about, for example, how much they missed him, with Ryan telling interviewers that his love for the King of Pop would never fade. There was also an element of seemingly proving to researchers that these participants were real fans, illustrating how their fandom influenced their identities, both individual and social, As, for example, Julian mentioned how she liked to dress up like Jackson, and Valerie stated that Jackson fans were like a giant global family. Communicating with other fans online was one way that several MJ fans explained their process of coping with the pop star's death, emphasizing their shared social identity of fans of the past king. The group Mourning process provided these fans also with a kind of support system to discuss and share their emotions and experiences. In the same way that friends and family members come together to pay their respects, recollect and outpour their emotions at a funeral or at a wake, fans who have a parasocial relationship with a public figure engage in similar processing online collectively. At the same time, the researchers noted that for some fans, frequent use of social media and greater exposure to information and posts about MJ's death seemingly stymied the mourning and recovery process, giving them constant reminders that reopened the parasocial emotional wound and led to ongoing rumination. For example, Nadej said that she had tears in her eyes any time that she would write something about Jackson on Facebook, and this emotional reaction was occurring still 5 months after his death. Well, Nadej, maybe it's time to just stop posting them.
Shut the fuck up, you don't have the talking stick.
Michael Jackson dies, women most affected. Jean stated he simply had to stop going online because it was driving him crazy. For the entire 17 months after MJ's death, the researchers found that the 3 most common themes in posts and their frequency of occurrence were identical: a great sadness, withdrawal symptoms, and nostalgic love, truly representative of the king's legacy. 8 messages out of 10 concerned at least one of these themes, and there was no reduction in frequency nearly a year and a half after his passing. These findings then are indicative that fan collective mourning online, wherein exposure to reminders of the death are constant and even encouraged by an algorithm that knows posts about MJ receive greater interaction from his fans and therefore will actively feed them more and more of it, only prolonging the parasocial breakup and preventing the fan from being able to negotiate their social identity as part of a fan collective, along with their individual identity, is a long process. Although Michael Jackson's death may have remained relevant to his fans months or even years after his passing, with fan commiseration perhaps fanning the flames of grief, is that the case for all celebrities, or something a bit more limited to pop culture royalty? A case study of posts on the 3 largest Yahoo forums dedicated to Dale Earnhardt Sr. before and then up to 2 weeks after his death from Radford and Block 2012 revealed that while the death of a beloved figure does increase messages, it tends to peak in the days directly following their passing. While the message boards became more active after his death than they generally had been beforehand, explicit mentions of his death steadily declined over time. Much like Michael Jackson, Earnhardt's death came as a shock to his many fans who could never have predicted that he would be involved in a fatal car crash during the final lap of the Daytona 500 in February of 2001, and the reaction of posters on these fan groups was coded into a variety of emergent themes. When the news broke, many posters seemed to follow some of the stages of grief, with early posts denying the veracity of the news, and with some posters continuing to ignore the information even after the driver's death had been confirmed. Several posts were angry either at NASCAR, the seatbelt manufacturers, or the speedway owner. The authors were surprised by the number of posts that aligned with the bargaining stage of grief, of which a common theme was posters seemingly offering up their own lives in exchange for Dale's. As one user said, quote, "I know part of me died Sunday afternoon in the 4th turn at Daytona. I wish I could have traded places with Dale. I would give anything to bring him back." Depression was the most commonly expressed emotion, unsurprisingly, which continued over a prolonged period of time in some posters. However, there was an event that may have led many towards acceptance, that being the win of Dale's teammate Steve Park in a race that occurred just a week after his death, which gave many fans something more to cheer about, and afterwards many returned to normal behavior of posting statistics, news stories, and simply talking about the sport, which is important because the racing fandom appears to be dying out. Like and share if you're a true racist. Another element of communication that these scholars examined in the Yahoo forums was introjection versus incorporation. Following the death of a loved one, it's common for mourners to attempt to hold on to feelings that the relationship is still somehow present, and introjection involves recalling and reliving past events that involve the loved one, such as to keep some element of that person alive within the imagination. Introjection behaviors include describing intimate memories associated with Dale, making pilgrimages to physical locations, and incorporating spiritual beliefs, as well as discussing the symbolic passing of the torch to Dale's son, Dale Jr., illustrated by one poster who wrote, "I have come to the conclusion that Dale wouldn't want us all pissing and moaning for him down here. I think he would want us to celebrate his victories and his accomplishments and support his family and cheer on the DEI, that's the Dale Earnhardt Incorporated drivers. I believe that when Junior straps himself into the number 8 car this Sunday, his dad is going to be sitting right there beside him. Several users emphasized the importance of community on their grieving process, as while one poster, David, announced on February 19th, the day after Earnhardt's death, that he was done posting for the near future as he attempted to cope with the passing, he returned just 3 days later, frequently using we and us language to describe the fans as a group that could come together to support Dale Jr. Don't forget, you're here forever. Finding support within the fan group seemed to be an important aspect of how many users managed their grief, and a common sentiment was that the forums were useful because people in their real lives were unable to relate to or understand the depth of parasociality experienced by these fans and caused a split between their fan identity and their other personal identities. For example, Megan posted of her coworkers that they, quote, "don't understand how someone I have never met could be so important to me, a member of the family." And Brenda similarly stated that, quote, "my husband has the same problem you do. They don't understand why he's so upset and they make fun of him. He hasn't hardly slept for 2 days and I'm getting really worried about him. I just talked to him and he's doing better. Glad you are here and stay tuned. You will get a lot of support from this very special group of people." In contrast to introjection, incorporation involves interaction with some form of physical representation of the deceased person to preserve their memory. Material objects, places, or activities associated with the deceased can all be used as a method of activating memories associated with the dead. Sarah explained how she had, quote, "been sitting with my Oreo cookie die cast in my arms, staring at pictures of Dale and stuffing myself with Oreo cookies."
When Counselor Troy is unhappy, she usually eats something chocolate. Chocolate. A chocolate sundae, for example. Although I do not speak from personal experience, I have seen it have a profound psychological impact.
I'll have 10 chocolate sundaes.
Meanwhile, in contrast, Megan described how the death had spurred her and her husband to take all of their Earnhardt collectibles down. Brad said that his wife was in the process of constructing a memorial, similar to the one that she had made to honor their deceased child, using their collectible merchandise. Despite the veneration of these objects, a very common theme across users was disdain for those who would seek to profit from Earnhardt's death by selling his merchandise at an increased cost out of a perceived increased demand. Levi expressed his disgust by posting, quote, "he was a person, a human being, and his death should not be treated like it was just some damn TV show to make money off of. People like this will have their day. What goes around, comes around."
The day of reckoning has come, and there's nothing Use the coupon code WARHEAD10. You'll get 10% off your first order, plus a free 2-liter bottle of Pepsi.
The results of this analysis illustrate, again, that fans grieve much as family and friends would for a deceased parasocial relation, but also that the mourning process does inevitably lead to healing, part of which is seemingly managed through community interaction and sharing memories, while physical objects and locations can also play an important role in allowing mourners to have a symbol to associate with the deceased person long after their death. However, any attempt to profit off of this grief is seen as profusely negative and met with disgust from fans. Just as there is always industry involved in a life of a celebrity, be it in getting eyes on a screen or on selling commemorative memorabilia, there is also an industry in selling death. So how does the death of a celebrity influence purchasing of goods related to that celebrity? Well, Radford and Block 2013 sought to answer that question by examining the sale of various autographed items, as well as DVDs and other products associated with a number of celebrities, politicians, and personalities who passed away between 2001 and 2006. Specifically, Ronald Reagan, Dale Earnhardt, Steve Irwin, Johnny Carson, Johnny Cash, John Ritter, Ray Charles, Don Knotts, Darnell Stenson, Rodney Dangerfield, Robert Palmer, Art Carney, and Bobby Hatfield, using information from eBay auctions both before and after these figures had died. Increased demand for celebrity memorabilia was explained by said celebrity's death, ranging between explaining 34% for John Ritter's autograph and 85% for an Earnhardt die-cast in variants accounted for. And death was broadly associated with an increase in interest in memorabilia for all celebrities. In terms of new items being listed on the auction website after the death of a famous person, numbers range between 41% for Ritter's autograph and 83% for a DVD of Ronald Reagan in terms of variants accounted for public figures, with Johnny Carson's sales failing to reach statistical significance. Across these auctions, all saw an increase in the cost of items, and only Earnhardt's die-cast and Ronald Reagan's autograph decreased in price in the 2 weeks after their deaths. Across all cases, iconic items, such as a commemorative t-shirt, saw less of a surge in demand than authentic items, such as autographs, but were also more likely to remain in supply. There was a greater change in demand for all types of memorabilia when the celebrity had died suddenly, compared to when their passing had been predicted. And despite the increasing demands, there was no evidence of an increase in bid price across the board. Thus, when a famous person has died, yes, people will be more likely to want to own some object associated with that figure, specifically an authentic item such as an autograph that allows the owner a sense of personal connection to the recently deceased. The sense of disgust that fans felt, often towards other fans who took the opportunity of the death of a celebrity to make a profit off of their merchandise, though, is indicative that there are societal expectations applied to what type of behavior is socially acceptable during the mourning process, even for someone with whom one only has a parasocial relationship. We really do live in a society. But just as some Earnhardt fans put away their memorabilia to avoid perhaps negative emotions, isn't it also possible that selling their memorabilia is a way that some fans might choose to cope with the passing of a celebrity? The habit of some to express their disdain towards the way in which others mourn or don't mourn, on social media in particular, has been referred to as grief policing. Not a Minecraft term, as I'm sure some might believe, and was examined in thematic analysis of Facebook comments regarding the deaths of Alan Rickman, David Bowie, and Prince from Gacht.
Hi, I'm Gene, nice meeting you.
That's a cute little dog you got there.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Fiesler and Brubacher, 2017. These researchers analyzed the top 100 comments left on CNN and New York Times articles posted to Facebook announcing the death of the three aforementioned celebrities within 24 hours of the news breaking. Among the 600 comments, they identified three major themes. The first theme was shaming other posters for not grieving adequately in a space seen as explicitly for mourning, of which there were two sub-themes, either accusing the poster of attempting to redirect attention towards themselves or attempting to redirect attention towards some other topic or issue. The second theme described policing comments that were seen as expressing inappropriate levels of grief. The third theme involved comments that were supportive of other users for grieving in a way that was seen as exemplary for other posters to model. Regarding the first theme, across all posts, there was an unspoken norm that the space was for grieving and not for criticism, and abided by the proverbial wisdom of never speaking ill of the dead. As one poster explained, quote, "As a huge fan of Bowie, it personally upsets me that people have chosen the moment of his death to bring up his past. However bad his past actions may be, using a person's death as a platform to voice your opinions on that individual isn't the right thing to do." Again, this theme was divided into two sub-themes, the first being attention-seeking, which included messages designed to attract likes and engagement, such as one comment that read, quote, "Michael Jackson, David Bowie, John Lennon, and Prince, there's gonna be one heck of a concert up there. Rest in peace." While that may seem innocuous, it was quickly identified by other posters as a message that the user had been leaving all over the website and was designed to farm likes and interaction rather than as a genuine expression of mourning and respect. Commenters also disliked instances wherein a poster mentioned themselves in relation to the deceased in a particularly positive light. For example, J.K. Rowling, being the typical target of ire she seems to have been for some time now, was excoriated by some posters for talking about the death of Alan Rickman, which led some to believe that she was planning to do something new with the character of Snape, when in reality she was just looking to remake Rasputin, Dark Servant of Destiny.
I know a brothel that has only gypsies. We'll go there, with God in mind and mankind in the flesh.
Although in all seriousness, looking at her tweets, I'm not really sure where that perception came from. Regardless, people thought that Rowling was attempting to draw attention towards herself and were displeased with that perception, however erroneous it may have been. The second sub-theme of inappropriate grief was exploitation of the death for the purpose of championing some other cause or issue. For example, following his death, former co-star Emma Watson posted a series of quotes from the recently deceased Alan Rickman, one of which made reference to feminism, a personal cause of Watson's and an act that rubbed many the wrong way, even leading to headlines which described the faux pas as a major controversy. One commenter in this analysis explained, quote, "There was no need for her to post about feminism. She could have easily stated how he was a great actor and left it at that, but no, that obsession with feminism had to come up. You can all say, oh, it's okay, they made other tweets about him. That isn't the point. The fact that she even had to think it was a good idea to post about feminism when he died is just wrong. Even though Watson had posted Rickman's own words regarding feminism, because it's her personal cause, it was seen as drawing attention away from the man himself, his career, and his legacy, which others found distasteful or even disgusting. And I can't say I entirely disagree, as it does somewhat come off as puppeteering a corpse for political points, particularly when the quote in question is extremely non-committal, stating,
"There is nothing wrong with a man being a feminist. I think it is to our mutual advantage,"
and almost sounds a bit mercenary, or at the very least pragmatic, and not an exuberant praise for feminism, but rather the kind of thing that Rickman may have had to say to Watson at some point on set to placate her surely incessant whining.
Oh my god! Hermione, shut up!
Commenters were also criticized for inappropriate emotional reactions, either being incommensurate for the relationship type, being parasocial in most instances, or being incommensurate with grief itself, typically in the form of celebration of the celebrity's death.
It's a shame that the IRA didn't kill the bitch.
Chucky alarm!
In regards to comments chastising those expressing excessive grief, as if the celebrity was a personal friend or family member, many attempted to police the excessive grief by telling other posters to control their emotions.
Control your emotions.
Hey, that's the name of the show.
With one commenter saying, for example, quote, "Okay people, I understand that Alan Rickman was a pretty good actor, even if he usually played grumpy types, but please stop with the whole boo-hoo, I'm so sad shit. You never met him, you didn't know him. Move on to being sad about something that matters." While other messages critiqued the outpouring of extreme grief as being misplaced in a world wherein death and suffering are commonplace. As another poster explained, quote, 31 Navy SEALs died late yesterday, all special forces and many who killed Saddam Hussein. 31! Anyone understand the impact of that? Or another who similarly wrote, quote, "It is too bad Prince is dead, but there our serviceman and woman died every day and CNN say nothing. That is what's sad." Clearly a very erudite expression of irritation.
Just send another message and it says, "Inside my hole has begun a new explosion."
Another element of grief policing came in the form of what one could describe as true fan gatekeeping, in that posters were suspicious of others who had seemingly come out of the woodwork to pay their respects for the deceased, identifying themselves as fans of their work, yet had previously not been outspoken about their fondness for the figure. For example, quote, "I find it funny that all of these so-called Prince fans want to become fans all of a sudden and label him a legend when yet a couple of days ago, none of these fans weren't talking about or praising him. You people on here are nothing but some lying hypocrite losers." Illustrating that publicly mourning the celebrity was seen by some as an act that was only to be undertaken by those with a parasocial relationship to the deceased, even if they had no personal relationship. Incommensurate grief policing largely came in the form of castigation of posts that were critical of the celebrity. David Bowie was heavily criticized for allegations of sexual misconduct, as well as for his perceived political beliefs, including the accusation that he was anti-Palestine, based apparently on a single line from Loving the Alien, which refers to the nation as a modern problem, and ironically, the claim that he was anti-Israel because he hadn't performed there since 1996. If you think Bowie was an anti-Semite for not performing in Israel, you might not want to look up the uncensored lyrics of Michael Jackson's "They Don't Care About Us." Either way, plenty of people were actively celebrating, if not just saying good riddance to the death of Ziggy Stardust, famed Zionist Free Palestine activist. But fans were quick to respond in anger to such comments. For example, quote, "You are a sad little man. Anyone who gloats or takes joy in anyone's death has an evil, tainted soul." Other comments simply dismissed the emotional reactions as misplaced, with one user saying, quote, "People die every day, not just famously people," and others reminding posters to think about the feelings of the family of the deceased before themselves. Many fans used a variety of names to refer to the stars, such as Professor Snape for Rickman, Ziggy Stardust for Bowie, and Davies, his surname, for Prince. Fake news or inaccurate information about the celebrities was met with scorn by fans, who were quick to correct it. In contrast, fans also tended to show their support for comments that they approved of and represented the type of message they believed was an appropriate form of mourning. This support included defending other commenters from criticism, with, for example, one poster saying, quote, "Please don't be so critical. Same thing is going to happen to us, but with less to say. People lets their emotions out during these sad times. There is nothing wrong with that, and to put them down for that, well, I don't think many people will have anything good to say about you, and I'm sorry for that." Illustrating that while social media users can be irritated by excessive emotional displays, there is a certain level of emotionality that is anticipated, if not demanded, in memorializing a deceased celebrity. Looking more closely to one of the aforementioned stars whose light has faded in the past few years, since social media became the dominant form of commiseration and sharing of grief amongst groups of people who have some connection to a public figure, we should talk a little bit more about Ziggy Stardust himself, David Bowie. Matley 2020 examined the types of posts users on Instagram made in the week following Bowie's death under the Bowie hashtag to understand how users reacted to the event, how users positioned their identities in relationship to Bowie as fans, and how Instagram posters used various types of media to interact with the musician's passing. Much as with Earnhardt, posts using the Bowie hashtag peaked immediately upon news of his death, with interactions increasing from near 0 units on the 10th to 6,000 on the 11th when the news went public, and then falling to about 1,000 units on the 12th, continuing to decline over the following week, until interactions reached near 0 again. The most common keywords used under the Bowie hashtag were mostly positive and celebratory, those being legend and hero, which were used to similar levels, followed by sad, then icon, and then goodbye, with only 38 posts referring to Bowie's death as a hoax. The most common type of imagery posted on the image-centric platform were photos of Bowie, followed by personal fan art, albums, and then film stills. The researchers found that the majority of posters appeared to be emotionally affected by Bowie's death, and that denial of his death was rare, but not non-extant. Anger was also present, with the onus of most posters' rage being directed at the vague concept of cancer rather than any individual or organization.
Oh, cancer, the crab, you caught something bad. It could be cancer, it could be crabs. Either way, say goodbye to your pubes.
Acceptance messages usually also included descriptions of depression or anger, but also illustrated how the user had come to accept Bowie's death, often with the inclusion of religious or spiritual language, with a specific emphasis on space and the stars, reflecting Bowie's music. Even so, sadness also defined the messages of many fans who used social media as a method of providing a short eulogy. A similar analysis was conducted by Vanden Bolk and Larson 2019 regarding David Bowie's death, on Twitter rather than on Instagram, in the 48 hours after his passing, to better understand the emotional responses of fans. The most common type of message, 23.3% of tweets, commented on the singer's musical legacy, followed by comments on his personal legacy, which comprised 19.4% of tweets. Interestingly, the same proportion of tweets expressed either love or hatred towards Bowie, both making up 1.6% of tweets mentioning him during the period of assessment. Moreover, when the authors sorted all tweets into general textual categories, while music-oriented messages remained the most common, messages of love appeared amongst the least, making up only 0.9% of all tweets, while anger or hatred in comparison comprised 1.9%. Again, both messages expressing parasocial love for Bowie and those expressing parasocial hatred for him were comparatively rare. None of the images posted to Twitter discussing the death were explicitly negative towards Bowie, with compassionate humor making up the smallest fraction of images at 6.7%, compared to music-oriented and acceptance-related messages, which comprised 20% of posts each, respectively. In contrast, the most commonly posted audiovisual content was clips of users either reporting on the news itself or on their personal relationship to the news, making up 26.7%, more than the music-oriented content and personal-oriented content, which both comprised 20% each of audiovisual posts, indicating that people were more likely to record a video of themselves reacting to the story than they were to type about it.
Taking pictures of rocks and plants on the street, cause you're useless in life with daddy's money. You're a
These scholars found that a large number of retweets were attributed to a small number of messages, with 11 retweeted more than 1,000 times, all of which suggests that a small number of Twitter users were driving the discussion, something we know from plenty of empirical data because Twitter is mostly bots.
Allegedly.
Specifically, 45.7% of popular tweets came from media sources, and a smaller amount of the most popular messages, 30%, were posted by celebrities or artists. Despite the popularity of mainstream sources, the most retweeted entry, which was retweeted more than 10,000 times, came from BBC blogger Mark Settle, and other bloggers including James Martin and Jenny Klein, which received more attention on the Bird app than major news publications. John Cena and countless other celebrities also sent tweets that gained a great deal of attention discussing Bowie's death. So much for that "you can't see me" thing, huh?
I can't see my hands!
Everything from restaurants to political organizations got in on the action, likely gaining followers as a result of their Twitter memorials to the iconic artist. Because Bowie's family largely remained silent immediately following his passing, users on Twitter instead retweeted a message from Bowie's son confirming that his father had died, and a several-week-old post from Bowie's wife that was simply an image of fan art. The voices of ordinary people, however, were largely absent from the media message storm that came along with the musician's death. As such then, while plenty of people use social media as a method of memorializing a celebrity that they hold a parasocial relationship with who has recently passed away, it is predominantly popular figures and news sources that gain the most attention, leaving the mourning of the average fan to be drowned out in the process. Although it does raise the question of who even is a celebrity now in the age of new media. And on the topic of who even is a celebrity, how do people react to the deaths of politicians or those in powerful positions who, while public figures in their own right, are typically far more divisive than pop artists, sports stars, or actors? Let's look further then into the death of leaders and political figures. There has perhaps been no greater public mourning event in modern history than that which followed the death of Harambe. But Diana, Princess of Wales, in August of 1997, was sure up there too. At the time, the excessive emotional reaction baffled some onlookers, such as Elizabeth Wilson, a scholar who wrote for the New Left Review Journal that she, quote, could neither understand nor share the apparent outpouring of grief, and noted the massive seeming influence of the parasocial relationship that many people felt with Diana as, quote, the death of someone who was actually a friend, and the more ethereal loss of someone known only as a media figure. An article from Screen Magazine described the performative nature of the mourning, stating that, quote, what is striking is the dominance of soap opera values in the way that people spoke about Diana's death. Talk about private feelings, the staple of soap opera, was valued as the best way of expressing grief, and indeed as a sign of grief itself. And also noted the lack of similar soap opera-esque public emotional disclosures from the Queen and Prince Charles had been interpreted by many as an inappropriate lack of grief altogether, if not evidence of guilt for being implicit in her death. Johnson, 1999, in Mourning Diana, Nation, Culture, and the Performance of Grief wrote that, quote, Diana was mourned so intensely because she was so widely available.
Phrasing.
Famous and vulnerable, for others to invest in as a source of pleasure,
Phrasing.
identity, and recognition, in a way that the rest of the royal family was generally not perceived, largely because she involved herself more directly with political issues, particularly the AIDS crisis.
Hey, phrasing!
That made Diana not just a relatable conduit that connected the common people to the nobility, but an icon for the gay community, perhaps exacerbated because she was, in fact, not a queen, that being their department. Despite being nobility herself, Diana was perceived of as one of the people, and thus her death came as a particularly emotional blow, not only to those who were thankful for her activism in destigmatizing AIDS and HIV, but for the immigrant communities of England as well. As Yasmin Alpai-Brown described in a piece for The Times, quote, 3 young black men were clutching each other and rocking gently. One of them, a man with a hard haircut,
had a dream about you and not tell me if my pit was hard. I'm telling you.
repeatedly moaned, "It's all finished, man!" Under one tree. Every tree had been made into a different shrine by believers. There was a group of Asian people being led in soft prayer by an elderly woman with a sabi. A teenage girl interrupted her, asking her in Urdu not to pray aloud because it would offend other people. Such terrible apprehension still about our very presence in this country. On the Thursday night, the whole of London's Southall Park was lit up by candles and chanting prayers by Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims, all of whom felt perhaps that here they could be free to their own bit of the princess and what she meant to them, to us. Curious how the last time Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims weren't murdering each other in the streets of London was because of the death of a rich white lady. Interestingly then, when the royals, who carried themselves with the emotional composure that is typically, historically, and socially expected, nay, demanded of them, so contrasted the soap opera-style mourning of the people, many turned some of their grieving into contempt and anger. It appears that there was some kind of mass-level emotional contagion event that spread amongst the people, and the fact that the royals did not publicly break down in grief as so many others did was seen as a slight to the common people. For example, a Sunday Times report from Tim Raymond stated, quote, "As news filtered through that the royals would join the cortege later, it was treated with contempt. Rita Myers, 60 of Romford, was full of feeling. When you have a funeral, your family follows from your home, she said. It's as simple as that. Kensington Palace was her home. They should have been behind Diana all the way." Steve Gutteridge, 43 of Bishop Stortford, said, "She was all alone when she left her home, and that's disgusting. I don't care what the protocol was." Although the sadness for Diana also produced rage towards the royals, illustrating the emotional volatility of the death of a public figure with whom many clearly held a parasocial relationship, it also was associated with what can only be described as an overwhelming expression of social identity, of Englishness, perhaps no better illustrated than by the queuing lines to place gifts outside Buckingham Palace, organized completely organically by mourners, As Jane Norrie wrote in the London Evening Standard, quote, Diana was mostly represented by hearts and flowers, by crowns, angels, and fairy tale princesses, with an emphasis put on the blondness of her hair. Sometimes a Union Jack was included, sometimes the flag of St. George. Not only the imagery, but the very careful drawing per se made the Englishness of it all unmistakable. What other culture in the world would have produced a cult along these lines? These displays of love and patriotism that accompanied the death of Princess Di were not limited to the British Isles, as people all over the world were similarly emotionally impacted by her passing. However, in some instances, much as how grief accompanied animus towards the royals, soon it similarly turned to hate as the mourning ended and the political machine continued its normal churn. For example, several murals painted around New York City in memory of Diana were vandalized in the weeks and months after her passing, injecting political messages such as, quote, we spent years of toil to break from the tyranny of British rule. No saints, no sinners, as documented by Taylor 1999. In the years and decades following Diana's death, several scholars were understandably interested in understanding the intense mass hysteria that her passing produced around the world. Thomas, 2002, in his book Diana's Mourning, A People's History, found, for example, that the seeming ubiquity of grief that was plastered all over the media coverage was not really so ubiquitous. As internal BBC polling in the months following her passing were indicative that 44% of those polled complained that the topic had received too much coverage. Another book, Interpreting Diana, Television Audiences and the Death of a Princess from Turnock, 2000, similarly found that according to a detailed examination of British attitudes towards the television coverage from the British Film Institute, revealed that only half of their 275 respondents reported being personally affected by Diana's death. Thomas, 2008, reviewed information from the Archive of Mass Observation, or MO, which doesn't at all sound like a fictional government agency from a trashy young adult dystopian novel, and requested open-ended responses, which they received and ranged from a single page to 24 pages, indicating people clearly had some things to say on this subject, and found rather than uniform mass mourning, the responses were quite varied. This particular survey also saw one of the lowest response rates among participants during its time of collection, as only 54% responded to the request at all, further providing some evidence in and of itself that perhaps the death of the princess was not as overwhelming to the mood of the nation as it was portrayed in the media. While one participant stated that she was more upset by Diana's passing than the death of her own father, another woman reported that her immediate reaction was to shout, "Whoopee!"
The fact is that stupid, ugly, overinflated bag has got to go. I mean that stupid, ugly vacuum cleaner bag.
Similarly, while some were deeply emotionally moved by the death, mourning, and funeral, others were annoyed by or even angered by the public's reaction. Participant B2638, let's call him Bob, and from now on I'll be simply giving names to these numbered participants using the first identifying letter. Anyway, Bob spoke about how Diana had been seen like more of one of the people than the other royals, suggesting that, quote, perhaps that is why our grief is so intense. She really was our princess. Which makes sense because she certainly got shared about enough to be considered a form of public transport. A woman who got around so much they put her face on the Oyster card.
Come on, what do I have to do to be able to make fun of this bin? Drive two planes into her? What's the point? They wouldn't even touch the sides.
But anyway, others were seemingly confused by the hysteria that they were seeing play out on television and in the newspapers. As Gary recalled, quote, I thought perhaps a famous revolutionary had died. It surprised me to find that the trade union activist expressed genuine grief over the death of someone from the aristocracy. It all seems absurd to call a woman brought up in wealth and privilege the people's princess. And Henry noted that while Diana was involved in some activism and had done some good, her impact and conviction was minimal in scale compared to the many who conduct humanitarian work in the field to relieve suffering. Politics again enter the chat in some of these respondent statements, as they inevitably are wont to do and historically did. As one left-wing anti-royalist nurse, wow, what a combination, the House is appalled but barely surprised, we'll call her Nurse Batchet, referred to Diana as a near-anarchist, and said that she had, quote, always dreamed what would happen if a royal became an anarchist, and said, up yours to their ways. Well, she must have been very happy with Prince Harry for about 10 minutes. This poor woman's hopes for the royals seems to have played out like a Greek tragedy. But perhaps that sentiment is why self-described royalists were instead unperturbed by the princess's passing, with Jay saying her death was, quote, for the best.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
Jay in this case, of course, being short for J. Elizabeth II, and another, Dees.
What's your name? Dees?
Believed Diana, quote, wanted to cause irrevocable damage to our beloved and much-needed royal family. Women generally seemed to be more preoccupied with Diana's death than were men in these responses. with Rachel, a self-described feminist, praising the princess's willingness to speak publicly about bulimia and mental health, and saw her as a role model for women all over the world. While in contrast, Martin described the mass mourning as just a bunch of women overreacting.
As Sun Tzu once said, all warfare is based.
Feeling as if one had a personal yet ultimately parasocial relationship with Diana was also a common theme amongst many responses, with her passing often described by people as like losing a member of the family or a friend. And there is some irony in that so many held such a strong parasocial relationship for a woman who probably would have thought that the term parasocial relationship meant a casual affair with the entire airborne squadron, while others were confused by these reactions, given that, simply put, Diana wasn't a family member or a friend to these people, and despite her frequent coverage in the media, was a complete stranger. Not that it had stopped Diana in the past.
Fancy dashing upstairs for a bit of necking?
Why, who's up there? One respondent, Robert, had quite a critical view of those grieving, as if Diana was an actual loved one, specifically because his wife had passed away just a week or two prior, and he viewed the mourning as performative, instead describing it as deplorable, as not being indicative of true grief. Others were even less polite, and considering Robert's circumstances, that's really saying something, as one woman, Patricia, reported that her mother had recently greeted her by saying, quote, "Bloody, cowing, rotten, lousy, stinking, bloody, lousy, princess, bloody, cowing, sodding Diana's dead, and they've took everything off for the cow," which may sound to some like she was simply having a seizure, but worry not, it's a condition just known as being English.
Well, Alice, it seems we both got autism, haven't we?
Yeah.
Well, that's good to know.
The inequality was also mentioned by participant Ghislaine, who was annoyed that her husband was given the afternoon off for Diana's funeral, yet would not have been given time off to attend the funeral of a friend. The clash in opinions on how people should react to the death of someone they don't personally know may even have had some real-world consequences, as one woman from Kent explained that she and her husband complained that the town's local hop festival was not cancelled in response to the death, to which the organizers answered that life's gotta go on. And more importantly, it would be ridiculous to cancel a beer festival in honor of a family who, if not for the sake of lager, most of their children would never have been conceived. Responses to the news coverage was also divisive, as while some had nothing but praise for the coverage, others were clearly annoyed that the news was inescapable, as Bill observed that,
"If a stray asteroid had wiped Australia off the face of the Earth, it might just have made page 14 of the Times or Telegraph somewhere at the bottom, and may have got a brief mention at the end of a specially extended edition of the 9 o'clock news."
People seem to be utilizing the media to inform how one should behave and should react, drawing from the behaviors of others to inform their own emotional responses. With a 48-year-old woman from Cheshire mentioning that upon hearing the news on the radio, she immediately began crying, but then questioned her own tears, worrying what others might think of her reaction. And when she met up with friends who were not upset by the news, she felt alone, and as though her reaction was uncalled for. Although these fears were quickly assuaged when she later saw media coverage of the national mourning, reaffirming the appropriateness of her emotional response, at least in her mind. Truly a woman moment. After the news became so overwhelmingly focused, even obsessed with covering the outpouring of hysterical grief, people began to become afraid of expressing anything but hysterical grief, for fear of being ostracized by others, something also known as a tantrum spiral. And not without good reason, as for example there was mass public outrage in response to Anthony O'Here's mild criticism of Diana, who he referred to as embodying childlike self-centeredness, despite having done much good, and was met with himself being described as, quote, a rat-faced loser in tabloids, and led to Tony Blair taking time out of his diplomatic tour of the Middle East to relay to his spokesman that O'Here was, quote, a right-wing, old-fashioned snob, and that the Prime Minister was appalled by his comments. Similarly, James Ferry, the CEO of Scotland's Football Association, was excoriated by the media and met with demands for resignation from Blair and Labour MP Jimmy Hood after he initially decided to not reschedule Scotland's World Cup qualifier match to be held on the day of Diana's funeral. Even several of the Scottish players, the Scots not exactly known for their undying love of the royal family, were reportedly unhappy about the prospect of playing that day, and eventually it was rescheduled. Or maybe they just wanted a day off to drink beer while laughing their asses off at the television watching all of the royals pretend to be sad.
My aunt lives in Scotland. She says it's quite nice.
Well, she's wrong.
The elevation of Diana into a status above even royalty in the eyes of the people to the point where any critique was forced to move underground was described by a Cheshire woman who recalled an interaction with some friends at a pub who were eulogizing the Princess of Wales, when one friend described her as, quote, a deceitful, manipulating, spoilt brat, which she responded to angrily before saying she felt sorry that he was unable to see why the people so deeply cared about Diana, with a stranger at the pub chiming in to support her position. Another subject reported that he would never be able to say what he really felt, lest he be labeled callous or cruel. As such, a number of respondents used the survey to express their frustration in private and anonymously, without fears of being socially ostracized for their opinions. Or as participant Paige explained, that she wanted to, quote, set the following on record so that the future doesn't think everyone in Britain was round the bloody twist. Clearly, there was a sentiment that it was neither the time nor the place, if nothing else, after Diana's death to discuss personal, political, or otherwise problems with the princess. And this may have been significantly influenced by the outpouring of grief and the mourning that was broadcast far and wide. The mass hysteria led to a necessity, to a certain degree, to participate in the event, even if just to keep up appearances, despite not personally being devastated or even caring about her death. As public opinion polling assessed by Worcester 1997 was further indicative, using a Mood of the Nation survey conducted by The Times in August of that year. In 1990, 58% of Brits believed that the monarchy would survive for another 50 years at least. And although this had largely declined over time, the first increase in perceptions that the monarchy was stable in the previous 7 years occurred after Diana's death. Opinions towards then Prince Charles, Diana's ex-husband, however, fell despite the slight increase in beliefs about the longevity of the crown. As while 50% of participants believed he would be a good king in August of 97, that fell 8 points in September, a total loss of 40 percentage points of British adults who reported thinking that Charles would make a good king since February of 1991. Similarly, there was a 12% increase in the number of respondents who agreed that Prince Charles should outright give up his place as the next monarch in favor of his eldest son, Prince William. On the day of and the day directly after the funeral, 52% agreed that the Queen should continue her reign, while 31% supported her standing down in favor of elevating William to the throne, and 12% supported her standing down in favor of Charles.
As I stand before you today, I'd like to address some of the tyrannical shit I'm going to do as king. First off, America, we're taking you back. You cunts have been free for far too long. I will not have it.
In the 3 to 4 days after the funeral, 65% of people polled thought that the Queen should stay Queen as long as possible, and only 27% that she should abdicate at some point in the near future. When instead asked if the country should remain under a monarchy rather than changing political systems, however, the consensus following Diana's funeral was overwhelmingly in favor of maintaining the sovereignty of the crown, with 73% supporting the monarchy compared to 18% who preferred a republic and 9% who simply didn't know. The numbers moved slightly in the 15 years since Diana's death, with about 20% of Brits favoring transforming the country into a republic, according to YouGov polling, consistently since 2012. Support for the monarchy hit a low point of 59% approval in May of 2022, before rising to a high not seen in the prior 6 years, directly following the death of the Queen, increasing to 67% approval. Even in a time of great tumult then, even when the royal line itself is being questioned, the British people were still quite in favor of keeping the Windsors on the throne. Well, there's the English public wanting to keep the Germans in charge, which is exactly what got the country into the EU in the first place. In the days directly before the funeral, Diana was the most popular member of the royal family, with a 90% favorability rating, compared to Queen Elizabeth's daughter, Princess Anne, at 76%, and the Queen with 57% favorability. In general, 58% reported being favorable towards the monarchy in general, with Charles being favored by 40% of respondents, and Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman who would go on to be his second wife, trailing the rest with only 13% favorability. To explain why, for those unaware of the now 25-year-old scandal, several years earlier, a leaked phone call evidenced that Charles and Camilla had been having an affair, and Charles had wished to marry Camilla as far back as the 1970s. But the marriage was seen as inappropriate, given Camilla's lack of noble background, being the daughter of a military officer rather than a blue blood, while Diana's familial prestige was seen as an acceptable choice for the wife of the future King of England. Many people in the tabloid media and the general public have long speculated that Charles was involved in Diana's death precisely because of this torrid love triangle. While it's been confirmed by Charles himself, a bit of a difficult thing to deny after the leaked phone calls, that he had been having an affair with Camilla.
I hereby renounce my claim to the throne of England so that I may be free to live as a tampon in the trousers of the woman I love.
It has also been widely speculated that Diana was having affairs of her own, which you may have picked up on from the extremely vague allusions that my ghostwriter has been making in joke form for the last several minutes. And she became publicly involved with Dodi Al-Fayed, son of an Egyptian billionaire, in July of 1997. The two were killed in a car accident wherein their intoxicated chauffeur was driving erratically away from the paparazzi in their incessant attempts to scoop any dirt on the relationship, and for which the yellow press refused to ever take any responsibility, instead shifting it back onto the royals. In the days after Diana's death, then, it surely shouldn't have come as a surprise that because she was seen as the people's princess, the people were not favorable towards relative commoner Camilla, with whom everyone knew Charles had been cheating on his now deceased wife with. Decades later, people are seemingly more willing to look back on these marriages with a little bit more sympathy towards Charles, who had apparently been in love with Camilla for nearly 2 decades, but had been pressured into a politically acceptable marriage in which it seems, at the very least, it's possible that neither party were particularly happy. But at the time, there was little love for Charles and even less for his paramour. Of those who supported the dissolution of the monarchy in the days after Diana's death, again a minority, just 18% of Brits, support was split evenly between the sexes, although women were more in favor of a transition into a republic. Older subjects were more supportive of the monarchy than those under the age of 55. However, Diana's death caused a massive shift in opinions for older adults, whose support for abolition of the monarchy increased to 23%, matching that of those under 55 2 days after her death. Similarly, working-class support for abolition nearly doubled, reaching 27%. Support for maintenance of the monarchy was stronger when respondents were asked how much they would prefer said maintenance over change into a republic if William were made the next monarch rather than Charles, with 82% responding in the affirmative compared to 11% supporting a republican system and 7% simply saying that, again, they didn't know. Although William was just 15 years old at the time, being the son of Prince Charles and Diana likely increased support for his assumption to the throne, as it would potentially represent some element of Diana's legacy. Again, at the time, Diana was beloved, even if not everyone in the nation was bereft with hysterics, and that, by nature of the situation, led to a great deal of distaste for Charles, even if not for the monarchy as a system in and of itself. When asked about specifics related to the relationship, only 19% approved of how the royal family had handled the divorce, while 79% believed that Diana had responded correctly to the separation. 73% believed the government had reacted appropriately to Diana's death, but only 37% believed the royal family had behaved as they should, again, all despite the continued support for the monarchic system over republicanism. These data are also indicative that the outpouring of support seen on TV, with thousands queuing to leave gifts, flowers, and condolences, did not necessarily align with the average person's actual behavior, as 26% reported having signed a book of condolences in London or elsewhere, 22% had not but planned to, 50% had not and had no intention to, and 2% were unsure of their intentions, a bit of an odd thing to be confused about. Similarly, only 17% of subjects said that they had left a floral tribute to the princess, and 11% said they had not but intended to, leaving 72% who were disinterested in leaving any physical signs of grief. Regardless of some of the seeming inconsistencies or conflicting opinions of many Brits, when asked if they had to pick who they believed had conducted themselves more appropriately in the recent past, 66% stated that Diana had come out ahead, and only 13% thought the royal family had acted correctly, while 12% said neither looked very good, and 9% didn't have any strong opinions. Thus, although the death of Diana did have some influence on people's politics, the influence was rather short-lived and returned to normal after a few days. And much as with political opinions, it seems that a lot of people wanted to display their sorrow publicly, but maybe only if it didn't cause too much of an inconvenience. While it is unquestionable that many people were mourning, there is also evidently an aspect of public performance and social identity management that comes along with the death of a public figure. As previously mentioned, the death of Diana did not just affect the British population, but instead caused ripples of grief throughout the world, particularly the Anglosphere. So how did people outside of England, namely in one of her closest allies, the United States, react to the princess's passing? From Brown, Basil, and Bocarena, 2003, who contacted U.S. residents of 8 major metropolitan areas, including Honolulu, Seattle, Los Angeles, Orange County, Denver, Chicago, the area from Virginia Beach to Richmond, and Boston, to participate in telephone interviews and surveys beginning 3 days after her death regarding their media consumption, their parasocial involvement with Diana, and their attitudes towards the press, the latter of which being a question that often receives quite aggressive responses. There was a positive correlation between exposure to any type of media coverage of Diana and identification with the people's princess. Further, the mere amount of hours an American respondent spent consuming television media, the more likely they were to identify with her. Those with lower levels of education tended to have a more negative attitude towards the press. However, all types of media consumption were positively and significantly, albeit to varying degrees, associated with identification with Diana. There was a fairly strong and positive correlation between identifying with the princess and having a positive attitude towards the media. There is some particularly cruel irony there, considering that the media were the ones who pretty much got her killed.
I'm gonna play both sides. Why would you tell me that? Should I not have? Probably shouldn't, because if you're trying to keep a secret from me, well, now I know.
Further, and perhaps unsurprisingly, women were more likely to identify with Diana than were men. Looking beyond correlations into predictive regression modeling, those between the ages of 25 and 35 tended to have the highest level of parasocial involvement with Diana. Greater consumption of television coverage significantly predicted involvement, indicating television viewing was a uniquely potent variable in this relationship compared to other types of media. Women spent more time following her death on TV, as did those closest in age to her within the 25 to 35-year-old age group. Heavier newspaper and television news consumers were, in general, more likely to follow the story. Unlike watching television, involvement with Diana was not significantly related to reading stories about her death in the newspaper. Regarding the funeral, women were more likely to report that she had watched or intended to watch it than did men, as were those in the 25 to 35-year-old age group compared to other age groups. Watching more television in general was related to watching the funeral, while general trends in news reading and radio listening were unrelated to viewership of the ceremony. Finally, involvement with Diana was positively associated with watching the funeral on TV. In contrast to raw correlations, greater involvement with Princess Diana was strongly associated with having a negative attitude towards the press. These results then are indicative of the role that feeling involved with Diana as a person played on attitudes towards the media, in that those who identified the most with the princess were perhaps more likely to blame the media as playing a part in her death, which makes sense considering the paparazzi were stalking her when her drunk chauffeur crashed their car, or generally just disliking the coverage of her death. As such, and as we might expect, people who identify with a recently deceased media figure will have a kind of parasocial relationship with that figure and are more likely to be interested in watching coverage of their death and funeral, although they may also tend to be highly suspicious of media coverage the more involved he or she is with the figure's life story. Even across the Atlantic then, people were clearly not only interested in Diana's death, but the more invested they were in the story, the less trustworthy they were of the press, perhaps seeing them as enemies of the woman in whose life they had become so parasocially involved, and the press so parasitically involved. Given that Diana and the royals are likely far less relevant to the interests of Americans than, well, American politicians and celebrities, it is probable that the proximity of a celebrity or public figure plays a role in how the public reacts to his or her death, seen, for example, in the significant decrease in support for the monarchy immediately after Diana's death. To better understand how personal involvement and proximity, and beliefs as well, can alter reactions to death of a powerful public figure beyond just a celebrity, we can look to a study from Schmidt et al. 2007 in their assessment of the psychological responses to the death of Pope John Paul II in Italian atheists and Catholics between 1 and 6 days after his death. Participants were asked about when and where they were when they learned about the death, how much factual information they were able to recall, how important the event was for their lives, the emotions the news produced, how surprised they were by the event, the frequency with which they followed mass media, and various demographic variables. Additionally, Catholic respondents were asked a series of questions to gauge how religious they were, between being simply faithful to being a strict churchgoer. Nearly 89% of respondents learned about the Pope's death on the day of, 74% within the first hour that it had been announced, with the remainder finding out later in the day. The majority of people, 59%, were informed via television report, and the other major source of news was other people, 27.7%. There was a positive association between religiosity and correctly recalling the date of the death, day of the week, and the time, as well as the cause of the death. Unsurprisingly, the Pope's death was more important for highly religious groups, followed by those moderately religious, and then those least religious. And finally, it was of least import for atheists. Perhaps the least surprising finding that I've ever read. Nearly identical results were reported concerning how consequential the Pope's death was seen for one's personal life, being most consequential for the most religious and of lowest consequence for atheists, again, beyond predictably. In general, participants were not very surprised by the passing of the Pope, which makes sense considering that he had been hospitalized just 2 months prior and had undergone a tracheotomy. But younger subjects were more surprised by his death than older ones. Younger participants were more likely to report feelings of anger, fear, interest, and guilt, whereas the older subjects were, the more likely they were to report feeling just bored. Highly and moderately religious subjects reported more intense sadness, interest, fear, anxiety, anger, and guilt than did atheists and those low in religiosity. Similarly, more religious participants were less likely to report feeling bored than those low in religious beliefs and atheists. In line with the aforementioned findings, the same trend was present in association with following media coverage of the Pope's death, with the most religious participants paying the most attention to the news and the atheists paying the least. Again, all unpredictably. There was, however, a curvilinear relationship between happiness and religiosity in that individuals low or moderate in religious faith felt similarly low levels of happiness in response to the Pope's death. Atheists and the most religious both felt happier about the news than either of the other two groups, although this did fail to reach statistical significance. Despite that, these non-significant findings are illustrative that perhaps, while atheists were glad that the Pope had died for their own reasons, very religious Catholics were also happy, albeit for a very different reason, with these Catholics likely rejoicing that he was out of the misery of the mortal coil, and atheists rejoicing that he was out of their misery.
I bet the last 2 months of his life, he was just sitting in that chair going, God, I wish the world would stop praying for me. Let me go.
There is another political figure whose death brought a great deal of joy to people, but not because they believed that she had gone to a better place. And that's former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
The cum snatcher!
Whose death was discussed by Hadley 2014. Did you think all the spitting image footage in this video was anything other than foreshadowing? In the immediate wake of the Iron Lady's passing, 2 hashtags began trending on Twitter. Hashtag Thatcher and hashtag No State Funeral.
Give her a state funeral because a lot of people will want to pay their last respects, and a lot more people will want proof that she is really dead.
Posts using the first hashtag were a mix of both positive and negative, mostly talking about Thatcher as a person, while posts using the second were, as one could guess, almost entirely negative and instead focused on her political policies. Of the tweets that were positive towards Thatcher, most emphasized her personal achievements, rather than her politics, and memorialization took the form of posting photos and quotes attributed to Attila the Hen. Many comments found soft ways to be critical or at least not overly supportive of Thatcher while avoiding speaking ill of the dead, with Mehdi Hassan stating that, quote, he loathed her policies but admired her conviction politics. And then President Barack Obama tweeting, quote, she stands as an example to our daughters that there is no glass ceiling that can't be shattered. Of course, provided your handbag is iron-shod. But regardless, a message that was retweeted more than 11,000 times as of 2 years later in 2014. Not all users were pleased with Obama's somewhat convenient avoidance of directly praising Thatcher, the politician, by instead speaking positively of Thatcher, the woman, with Una King saying in response to the president that Thatcher had, quote, smashed the glass ceiling only to reinforce it with concrete. Dropping Thatcher from the draft for Team Women seemed to be a common sentiment, as user Feminism Tips similarly was critical of, quote, women in positions of power who mimic patriarchal men for their own gain, in response to Thatcher's death. Which is, frankly, an understatement, because Margaret didn't so much as mimic the patriarchy as she did surpass it in viciousness. Many users were far less delicate in their disdain for Thatcher, as imagery and depictions of her burning in hell were common.
For 3 million, they could give everyone in Scotland a shovel, and we would dig a hole so deep that we could hand it over to Satan personally.
As one user, Di Reese, described her as, quote, the apartheid-supporting, Pinochet-loving, community-destroying, warmongering, milk-snatching devil incarnate. A glowing review. And another user, Madge, wrote, quote, it's about time the old bag croaked it anyway. The latter of which forms something of an interesting dichotomy because the poster clearly recognized that Thatcher was an elderly woman, yet wished death upon her anyway. She was just that powerful, apparently. Let's face it, she was basically Oliver Cromwell with a handbag, and the added bonus of taking a page out of William the Conqueror's book by just murdering everyone in the North for pretty much no reason. But not all users were comfortable with the Thatcher bashing, as Tom Allen commented that, quote, celebrating the death of an elderly lady is disgusting and you should be ashamed. Although to be fair, if it had been some political enemy of hers who had died, I'm fairly sure Marge would have had a go at them as well.
Would you like to order, sir?
Yes, I will have a steak.
How'd you like it?
Oh, raw, please.
And what about the vegetables?
Oh, they'll have the same as me.
It seemed that many believed that mocking and celebrating Thatcher's death was deserved precisely because of her politics, with user Miller Skipworth sarcastically tweeting that it was poor form to gloat about the deaths of others while posting an image from the Sun newspaper featuring a photo of the sinking of the ARA Belgano, with the headline, "Gotcha." The joke being that the Belgano was sunk during the British invasion of the Falkland Islands, orchestrated by Thatcher. Openly cheering for the death of one's political opposition does, however, have the tendency to make one's entire political side look rather uncivil, if not outright evil, and as such, it was not uncommon for users to encourage their fellow posters to cool it with the anti-Thatcher remarks. As Mark Dunn explained, quote, "If you believe in humanity and social justice, you can't celebrate death, even the death of one who violated both," indicating that for some, mocking the death of Thatcher was the last straw. Get it? An infographic from Meltwater that displays social media statistics associated with what people on the web were saying about Thatcher's death within the 12 hours after it was announced illustrates that her passing was certainly a hot topic, with more than 900 comments being posted mentioning her per minute in the first 3 hours after the news broke. 46% of messages came from the UK, 25% from the US, 6% from the Netherlands, and 5% from South Africa. And no, there's been enough spitting image today, no matter how much I would like to play a few bars from the nice South African song. Oh, to hell with it.
Guys never met a nice South African, and it's not bloody surprising, man, 'cause we're a bunch of ignorant love-nuts with no sense of humour.
With the subject also being frequently discussed in Australia, Canada, Norway, Sweden, and France. Keywords most commonly associated with posts discussing the Iron Lady's death were Mandela, apartheid, Reagan, and milk, which sounds like a setup for a very elaborate aristocrats type joke. But if you're confused about the inclusion of the word milk, that refers to Thatcher's infamous push for legislation to end free milk for students over the age of 7, landing her the title Milk Snatcher by critics. Mandela and milk were keywords more frequently mentioned the further north in Britain and into Scotland you went, while the South tended to be speaking about Thatcher more generally, illustrating the regional differences in opinions towards her. There were a spare few tweets that were positive towards Thatcher's political legacy, with user Archie Mohan providing a rare message of praise for her policies saying, quote, "My dad, a working-class immigrant who came to this nation penniless. Margaret Thatcher let him reach his ambitions." However, this was the seeming exception to the rule. Far more common were comments placing the blame of all problems in Britain and its politics on Thatcher's tombstone, as the account Moron Watch lambasted the former PM's policies, tweeting, quote, "It only took 20 years for the hashtag Thatcher financial deregulation to wreck the economy," while Dickie Moore seemingly tried to find a middle ground between disrespecting the dead and disparaging her politics, commenting that, quote, "Although the person is dead, the ideology is very much alive. Would be so much better the other way around." Similarly, a Facebook comment from Billy Bragg, shared to Twitter, encouraged others to not celebrate Thatcher's death, but instead to use it as a political motivator, saying, quote, "Raising a glass to the death of an infirm old lady changes none of this. Don't celebrate, organize." Illustrating that even amongst people who might despise a political figure, many are aware that speaking ill of the dead is a bad look for their own political cause, as I myself have learned. So with that in mind, and with all of the information that we've looked at about how we react to the death of a famous public figure, particularly online, let's come to a few conclusions about parasocial mourning and the policing of grief. Over the course of this video, we've seen how people can have very deep parasocial relationships with public figures, be they kings of pop or actual nobility, and that there are certain social norms that are associated with reacting to the death of these figures publicly, much in the same way that there are norms as to how we react to the death of a person that we actually know personally. There is a time and a place to criticize someone for their actions in life, and usually directly after their death, when family and friends are in mourning, is not the right time. And others will police inappropriate displays of grief, whether that takes the form of mocking or celebrating the death of a famous person, or being overly emotional for a prolonged period of time. The data here, though, do seem to be consistent. It's just not looked upon fondly to speak ill of the dead, nor to redirect the attention being given towards the deceased towards yourself or your cause. There is instead an expectation of a near sacred period of mourning that must be respected, but which does inevitably end. So if you, like me, have ever tweeted something insensitive about a recently deceased politician, even if he was a warmonger, instead just press pause and consider waiting a week or so, not only because it is disrespectful to the family and friends, but because to do so violates a norm that helps keep our society, as fractured as it appears to be, at least somewhat cohesive. You don't speak ill of the dead. But hey, what do you guys think? Have you ever been emotionally affected by the death of a celebrity or a public figure? Have you ever talked trash about a public figure shortly after their death? Do you think it's wrong to bring up controversies of a person immediately following their passing? Can people grieve inappropriately, particularly for someone that they don't actually know personally? Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below to feed that algorithm. And while you're down there, be sure to check out my sponsor, linked in the description and in the pinned comment. If you really enjoyed the video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already, and click the bell to be updated when I upload one of these videos, which do take a long time to put together. If you really enjoyed the video, links to support are also down in the description, namely a link to my Patreon and Subscribestar, which you can sign up for if you would like to see your name here on the screen along with these fine folks in a future video. As always, an enormous thank you to all of my supporters. I could not put together these projects if not for your help. Thank you all so much. I've also linked to my merch store down below if you'd like to pick up a shirt or a mug related to social science silliness. If for some reason you'd like to hear more from me, I do 2 weekly podcasts on my second channel, again, linked below. Broken Crown, which I do every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. GMT, 3:30 p.m. EST with my co-host Spoon, which covers current news and events from the perspective of 2 monarchist, royalist, expat foreigners, both living in the UK. And Rolling in the Isles every Tuesday at 9 p.m. GMT, 4 p.m. EST, which is our tabletop role-playing game featuring myself, Commie Mark, and other friends. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volts.
You'll see it's all a show, keep 'em laughing as you go. Just remember that the last